A man went under, somewhere between the work raft and the stone pile.
Keep it steady. Pull.
If the engineering behind history's most impossible siege projects fascinates you, subscribe now. What this causeway reveals about the price of genius will stay with you long after the last stone is placed. 27 men turned to look. Diades of Pella, standing on the upper work platform with a clay tablet and a bronze stylus, did not. He was calculating the load distribution of the next stone course. Basalt rubble in the lower fill, dressed limestone on the upper skin, tightly interlocked. His numbers were correct. His numbers were always correct. The man in the water was not part of the calculation. This is the story of a causeway. Half a mile across the strait between the mainland shore at Ushu and the sea walls of Tyre. An island city that had never fallen, not to Nebuchadnezzar's 13-year siege, not to the Persians, not to time. The causeway was an engineering project. It was also a burial. The two things can't be separated, no matter how carefully you do the math. To understand how Diades built it, you have to trace every supply chain that fed it. Because a causeway on this scale isn't one project, it's 12. Each one its own workshop, its own craft, its own chain of specialization, running back through 3 kingdoms to the raw materials that started all of it. Start with the stone. Byblos was the man running the ruins of Old Sidon, 12 miles south. A Phoenician quarry foreman who had spent 30 years reading stone. Limestone versus basalt, dressed block versus rubble fill, what would carry load and what would dissolve under wave action in 18 months.
Take the temple stones. They're already cut, already moved once. The work of pulling them is half done.
So that's what they did. Macedonian infantry stripped the old city. Temples, harbor walls laid 300 years before, loaded the stone onto ox carts at dawn, and moved 1,200 pounds per cart over 6 miles of coastal track in the summer heat. The ox teams lost weight the army didn't have to spare. The timber was harder. Nicandros of Corinth, a master carpenter, 4 campaigns of siege work behind him, got his materials from Lebanon. Green oak, freshly cut. He wanted seasoned timber. He was told green oak was what the supply line could carry. He noted the problem in his supply request, formally, in writing, the first of many such requests, and began building anyway.
Green oak will split in the summer sun. If the Tyrians use fire, we'll have problems.
He wasn't wrong. But Diades had a schedule, and the schedule was the thing. Alexander wanted Tyre in 4 months. Diades had promised 6 weeks. The timber was going in.
It is correct. Proceed. Week 3.
The palisade screens were 8-foot oak planks mounted along the causeway's outer edges, blocking direct arrow fire, intercepting bolt shots at low trajectory. What they couldn't stop was burning material dropped from height, or fire carried on a hull at waterline with the wind behind it. The causeway's timber cradle, the framework of beams and cross bracing that aligned the stone fill, was held together with rope at every joint. 60-strand hemp, soaked in olive oil, twisted under tension by teams on the beach. A half-mile of causeway required more rope than the entire Macedonian fleet used in rigging. Made on-site every day in a rope walk that never stopped.
Current consumption sustainable. Replace what is lost at the rate we lose it. That is the formula.
Somewhere between the quarry cart and the torsion spring workshop, between the rope walk and the stone setting crew, was Talos, a Macedonian infantry conscript on stone hauling detail. He carried rubble from the cart offload point to the fill zone, 30 yards at the start of the project, eventually 400. 3 months on the causeway. Nobody had told him what he was building. He'd asked twice. The crew foreman said, "A road," the first time. The second time, "Shut up and carry." In his left hand, alongside whatever rubble he was moving, he carried a smooth stone, quarried limestone worn by water into something almost round. It fit his palm exactly. He couldn't explain why he carried it.
Contract. Expected delivery 15 days.
There's something genuinely extraordinary about watching an engineering system this size operate in the 3rd century before the Common Era. No cranes, no concrete, no surveying instruments beyond plumb lines and water levels. 12 different specialists, quarrymen, carpenters, rope makers, artillery builders, masons, logisticians, each working at the limit of their knowledge, passing output to the next craft in the chain. Pharaon, Diades' personal assistant, 23 years old, deeply earnest, copied everything Diades said into wax tablets. He'd already written down that the causeway would be complete in 6 weeks. He wrote it down very neatly. He would still be writing when the 7-month mark arrived. At dusk on the 43rd day, the Tyrian navy showed them something that wasn't in the calculation. It came from behind the seawalls, slowly at first, so slowly that the watch crews thought they were looking at tethered hulls being repositioned. Then the wind caught the sails. 2 triremes, old ones, holds packed with dry cedar shavings, pine resin, naphtha, sulfur. Crews just enough to steer, aim the hulls, and jump at the last moment. The wind was from the northeast. The wind was always from the northeast in August. The fire ships ran before it, straight at the causeway's eastern flank, trailing fire as the resin caught and the 40-foot hulls became, in approximately 4 minutes, 200 tons of burning timber heading at full speed toward 140 yards of green oak palisade soaked in 8 months of summer sun.
I told him about the fire.
By morning, the eastern palisade was ash. Work rafts burned at their mooring lines, charred ribs still visible at low tide. 11 men not accounted for. The causeway itself, the stone fill, the rock core, had survived. Stone doesn't burn. Diades walked to the water before dawn. He stood at the edge of what remained, looking at the ash floating on the surface of the strait. Then he went back to the compound and picked up his calculation tablet. The math had changed overnight. A 50-foot causeway was vulnerable because burning material from one side could cross the road surface and catch the other. The solution was width. 200 feet would separate the eastern and western screens by 160 feet of open stone. Nothing a fire ship could bridge. 200 feet meant 4 times the stone, 4 times the carts, the rope, the quarry labor, the screening, and, though this didn't appear on any tablet Theron kept, 4 times the exposure on the work surface. Diades didn't consult Nicandros. He calculated the new dimensions, sent the requisition to Crateros, and assembled the crew foreman the next morning.
Approved. Additional labor from the Lydian conscript pool. Replacement timber from the Lebanon contract. Expected delivery 15 days.
15 days was too slow. Diades pulled infantry off rear area duty. Alexander agreed without objection. The second causeway is where the craft chain becomes genuinely extraordinary. Diades designed a 2-level fill system, rubble core, dressed stone skin, that distributed load weight outward from center. The causeway could carry full siege equipment, towers, rams, torsion artillery platforms, 3,000 men in armor. This wasn't fill and flatten. This was structural engineering on a scale that hadn't been attempted since the Persian canal works. The stone-setting crews worked in shifts, 8 men to a large block, 2 on the iron pry bars, 2 on rope lines, 4 pushing once it was lifted. The foreman had developed a system of hand signals that communicated placement adjustments across the noise of the work zone without language. Signals so refined by the second causeway that the best crews could place a 1-ton block in 12 minutes. Nicandros redesigned the screening architecture for the wider road surface and submitted another supply request for heavier, seasoned oak, citing fire risk. The request went to Crateros. Crateros marked it for logistics consideration. The heavier oak didn't come. What came 2 weeks later was an approval notification. Source: Old Sidon ruins, which Nicandros had already stripped.
Thank you for the approval.
What Diades watched with something approaching aesthetic satisfaction was the counter-battery platform taking shape on the causeway's far end. A raised timber and stone structure designed to carry 2 torsion catapults elevated high enough to fire over the Tyrian seawall's parapet. The engineering problem was vibration. Catapults produce significant lateral shock when fired, and that shock, transferred into a causeway that was essentially a pile of rubble held together by rope and stone weight, could loosen the fill. Diades solved it with a shock-damping frame, an inner timber cradle that isolated the artillery from the causeway below it. Nobody had done this before. If you want to see how Alexander's fleet finally broke the Tyrian navy's hold on those sea approaches, that story's coming next. But subscribe first, or you'll miss it when it drops. The morning they reached the underwater shelf was clear and windless. 8 feet of water. The seafloor was limestone, solid, load-bearing. The stone-setting crew at the advancing edge could see the Tyrian seawall directly opposite. They could see the artillery crews. They could see the war machines. They could see because they were close enough to be within optimum firing range of everything the Tyrians had. The first Tyrian bolt cleared the eastern screen and struck the stone platform 4 feet to Diades' left. The stone around the impact was gouged. The bolt had shattered on contact, but the speed at which it arrived, barely visible in flight, a dark streak that was there before you registered seeing it leave, told every man on that platform something the calculations hadn't quantified. The closer they got, the more exposed they were. There was no safe point. They were building toward maximum danger, one stone at a time. The pitch pots came at mid-morning. Ceramic vessels the size of a man's torso, filled with naphtha and pine resin, fired on short-range catapult trajectories that cleared the screens with room to spare. They broke on impact and spread burning liquid across the work platform. The sound of them, the wet crack, then the whomp of ignition, was distinct enough that after a few days, the hauling crews knew what it was before they turned around. Nicandros lost 6 men in 11 days. Not to bolt fire, not to arrow fall, to pitch pot coverage. The screening that would have stopped those pots, heavy angle-set oak baffles on extension arms creating overhead coverage in addition to lateral blocking, had been in his supply requests for 4 months. She came to Diades in person. Every other request had gone through the formal supply chain, properly documented, properly routed. But the formal chain had returned his requests with logistics priority ratings placing heavier oak behind ship timber, behind horse fodder, behind 11 other categories. So he went to Diades' compound himself at mid-morning while the man was at his work table. Theron, who was there, recorded that Diades did not look up for 8 minutes. What Theron wrote: North of Corinth arrived at the compound table at the 2nd watch of morning, 3rd day before the Ides. Master Diades was at calculation. N stated his case. Master Diades continued at calculation. At the conclusion of the 8th minute, Master Diades looked up and said, "The oak request is noted. It remains at logistics priority 3. N left without further statement. It wasn't that Diades hadn't heard. He understood the numbers perfectly. 6 dead in 11 days, on one section of one side of the causeway. He had a casualty tolerance figure Crateros had given him at the project's outset. Nicandros' section was within it.
Within tolerance. He said within tolerance.
The coordinated barrage came 3 days later. The Tyrian artillery had been ranging on the approach cradle for a week, calibrating with the methodical patience of men who had been defending their walls for 23 years. 4 catapults firing in succession walked their shots down onto the framework in under 2 minutes. 3 direct hits. The joint at the primary crossbeam gave. 40 feet of timber dropped into 8 feet of water, taking 6 hours of dressed stone fill with it. A cloud of white lime dust hung over the strait for 20 minutes. 3 men went down. Talos was one of them. Under the partial collapse for 4 minutes. What pulled him out wasn't a rescue team. Diades hadn't established one. But Nicandros, who had been watching from the screen repair station on the eastern side. He ran the length of the causeway, 300 yards, and dug with his hands in the rubble until Talos came up. Talos was still holding his smooth stone. Nicandros walked back to his section. He gave 3 orders to his crew chiefs, clearly and specifically. Then he went to his tent and didn't come back. The machine moved on. That's what machines do. The rope makers made rope. The quarry carts moved stone. The setting crews placed their blocks in 12 minutes each. Replacement screens went up in green oak. The causeway grew. Diades received the cradle collapse via Theron's daily report, noted it, adjusted the schedule 12 days. Received Nicandros' departure as a personnel issue. Requested a replacement from Crateros. Crateros sent one. The new carpenter supervisor was efficient. He didn't ask about the crews. He didn't ask which sections were weakest. He didn't ask what the men had noticed about the Tyrian artillery patterns. Nicandros had collected that intelligence every day. The foreman had always also talked to him, because he asked. Nobody replaced that function. And the causeway kept growing. Forward, always forward, toward the seawall that was close enough now that the men on the work surface could hear the Tyrian artillery crews giving orders. Diades walked the causeway end to end on the morning of the 206th day. He hadn't done it since week 2. His feet remembered the slight give in the planked walkway, the fill beneath still settling, the road alive by micro-increments. He'd designed that movement in. Stone compresses under wave action. It gets stronger. He saw the scorch marks first. Long brown and black streaks on the eastern screen where the pitch pots had cleared the top edge. Some sections replaced, new oak almost yellow against the dark of the old. He counted the unreplaced sections. 11. Gaps that had been gaps for at least 9 days. He kept walking, past the counter battery platform, past the stone setting station, past the 3-craft joint where teams from different source chains worked simultaneously within 20 feet of each other, none able to stop without halting the others. And then he saw Talos. In the stone hauling line, Phil Rubble in his right hand. In his left, smaller, gripped at the waist, a smooth, pale stone. Not the piece he was hauling, something he'd brought from outside the work. Diades stopped. He watched Talos put down the rubble, straighten, pick up another piece, walk 30 yards, drop it, walk back, pick up another piece. Talos didn't see him. Nobody had told Talos to look at the work platform supervisors. Nobody had told Talos very much at all. Diades found Nicandros sharpening a chisel, not because it needed it, but because the motion kept his hands useful. They'd worked together 4 campaigns. They didn't say much. Diades sat on the storage chest by the tent entrance. After a while, he said the screens on the eastern flank needed replacing.
I know.
Nicandros came back. The causeway reached the island's foundation stone 18 days later. 240,000 cubic yards of material moved into the strait. 12 crafts, 7 months, a road across a sea. The assault went through on the 234th day. The seawall breached at 2 points. One from the causeway's end, where the ram towers had been working for 6 days, one from the fleet, where the southern approach had a cracked section the Tyrian engineers hadn't fully reinforced. Diades watched from the mainland beach. The causeway was exactly as designed. 200 feet wide, stone-skinned, level-surfaced, carrying the weight of everything he'd promised Alexander it would carry. The engineering held. The city fell in the time it takes a stone to settle and fill. After a while, Diades walked to the water's edge. The causeway trembled under the weight of thousands of feet crossing it. Vibration transmitted stone to stone all the way back to the beach. Byblos had said months ago, "The sea doesn't forget what you put in it." He'd meant it as a compliment. The causeway was built well enough that sediment would accumulate against it over centuries, the silt filling its foundations, and eventually, not in any lifetime Diades would see, the strait would become land. The island would become a peninsula. The sea would be filled. He was standing on the edge of what would, in 2,000 years, become a coastline. The indifferent sea was already beginning to forget the shape of what it had been. He'd spent 7 months filling the sea with stone. He built a system that worked. The problem was solved. And now, he was standing at the water's edge, watching what the sea would do with what he'd given it. And he found he didn't want to calculate anything. Talus went home 8 months later. He still had the stone. He couldn't explain it to his family. They wanted to know what he'd carried all that way for. He said it fit his hand. He said that counted for something. The causeway he'd built without knowing what it was is still there. Not as a road, as geography. The silt turned the strait into a narrow neck of land. Tyre, which had never been taken by siege before, is now the tip of a peninsula. The city of Sur in southern Lebanon. His stone fill is under it. Diades stopped building at the water's edge. He never built another causeway. The craft he'd mastered, the thing he'd been the best in the world at, he set it down. Not because he'd failed, because he'd finally understood what it was for. The universe didn't tell him to stop. The universe didn't care. It had watched 30 men go into the strait and watched the causeway grow and watched Tyre fall, and it had no opinion on any of it. That's the thing about an indifferent universe. It doesn't stop you. It doesn't push you. It just is there. And sometimes, that's exactly enough to make a craftsman put down his tools.
The catapult. Aim and fire.
The causeway, the stone, the craft, still there.